That's cool. Is there anyone that you're in communication with that would be watching this? That
I can ask someone to get on it.
could you email me this link and then I'll forward it over to my assistant and have her watch it?
What's your email?
John, John.
This thing was just like.
Packed house.
Yeah.
All right. Because I'll just adjust the microphone if need be. Underscore Mazza.
Mazza?
M-A-Z-Z-A. Z-Z.
Mazza?
Yep, at Brown.
Stop. Stop.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much.
Okay. Can you bring the live stream back up over here? Okay, there we go. Great.
Thank you.
Yep. Hey, Rich.
How are you?
Good. How you doing?
All right.
We have a live stream.
Great. So when we have the video, we just have to move it a little bit and then we come back and that's it?
Yeah, that's it. I'll stay here with you for a little bit.
And it's inverted, right? So
Yeah, it's inverted. But, well, it's inverted to us, but people on the other end will see it the way it's supposed to.
perfect. Thank you.
I'll move it over to the panel once it's time for Q&A. If you just talk into the mic over there, though, that's.
They present sitting down, we're gonna get the mic.
Yeah, I'll just move the mic back over there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I want to welcome all of you, including those who are joining us on the live stream through the internet. My name is Richard Snyder. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And I want to welcome you to a teach-in on Mexico's missing students. This is a timely and important opportunity for reflection and discussion about the tragic disappearance of 43 Mexican students in Ayotzinapa, located in the southern Mexican state of Guerrero, and also to think about the implications of this for Mexico, for U.S.-Mexican relations, and for all concerned citizens across the world. I want to say something briefly about the origins of this teaching. And then before I introduce our panelists, we have 4 panelists here today, we're going to present to you a short 5-minute video that will give you some important background information about the event today and the events in Mexico. Okay, so the origins of this event, the most important thing for me to say is that this grew out of a student initiative. 3 Brown students from Mexico, Alejandro Bertis, and 2 of our panelists, Paula Martinez and Camila Ruiz, came to see me in my capacity as director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And they said, we have to do something about this, about the disappearance of the Mexican students. Paula and Camila, who are on the panel, had recently published a co-authored piece, a very good piece, in the journal, the Brown Political Review, entitled Ayotzinapa, Exposing the Fallacy of the Mexican Moment. And I want to thank both of them and also Alejandro Bertis for bringing this initiative to us. As I said, before introducing the panelists, we're going to be showing a short 5-minute video entitled Mexico, the Wound of the World. And this will give you some important contextual and background information about the disappearance of the students and also about the broader problem and ongoing problem of violence in Mexico today. The video, I want to point out, was produced by a transnational civil society network, which is called Global Forum. And in fact, this teach-in event is part of a series of events that are taking place in universities across the globe to help inform the public about Mexico's political situation, as well as to promote dialogue and citizen participation. And if you want to learn more about these other events and the Global Forum Network, you can go to hashtag, then it's one word, Global Forum Ayotzinapa. Also, before the video, I want to call your attention to another event that we're holding tomorrow here at Brown University that's connected to this one. On the main green of our campus here at Brown, we're going to have a memorial exhibit. And the exhibit will consist of 43 empty chairs on the green here at Brown to commemorate, to remember the missing students. And we want to ask all of you to pass by the exhibit, take a moment to remember the students, and also you can become a voice for those who are silenced. And you can do this by showing your support for this, by taking a picture and then sharing it on social media, a picture of the memorial exhibit tomorrow. And I also want to acknowledge at this moment another Brown student, Silvina Hernandez, who's a sophomore here at Brown from Oaxaca and California, and she took the initiative to organize the memorial exhibit for tomorrow. Okay, we're going to turn to the video. One last thing, those of you who are watching via live stream, I'm not sure you're going to be able to watch the 5-minute video and hear it. However, you can watch it on YouTube. And you can go to YouTube, and the link for that is on the Facebook site for this event, which is hashtag Ayotzinapa, a teach-in on Mexico's missing students, for those of you joining us by live streaming, okay? And if you can't watch it now, you can watch it later on YouTube. Okay, let's turn to the short video. Camila, can you help me get this on? We want to turn the lights, dim the lights if we can.
I don't even know your kids.
8 years ago, the president of Mexico, facing a highly contested election, decided to declare a war on drugs. To do this, he called the military to the streets. The results were that Mexico went from having 9,900 murders per year in 2005 to 23,000 in 2013. On December 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto from the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, became president of Mexico. The PRI was in power from the 1920s until 2000 and had many accusations of disappearance and violence against students. Enrique Peña Nieto's first action as president was to create alliances with Congress to push for reforms, most of them related to the economy. He invested heavily in cleaning Mexico's image abroad, running various editorials in world newspapers, and pushed security to a less prominent place than his predecessor. Yet, the violence continued. Not because you ignore a problem, it means it goes away. In 2013 alone, 23,000 people were killed. 1 out of 3 homes reported to have been subject to a crime, and even the government accepts that more than 90% of crimes are never resolved. On September 26th, a group of students was protesting on Iguala, the 3rd largest city of Mexico's poorest state, Guerrero. The municipal government and the state government both belong to the opposition leftist party, PRD, Party of the Democratic Revolution. The local police came in, killed 6 students and arrested the other 43. There is no record of the students in any jail. In the weeks that followed, 10 mass graves were discovered around Iguala. The mayor of the town and his wife ran away after a local newspaper showed the mayor's brother-in-law was a drug dealer. He was finally found on the 4th of November, hiding in Mexico City. While this crisis was going on, the president of Mexico decided to go on tour to China and Australia, as they are important business partners. But it has been more than a month, and he has yet to visit Iguala, less than 5 hours drive from Mexico City. On November 7th, Mexico's Attorney General gave a press conference where he announced that according to some of those interrogated who showed signs of torture, they believed the students had been killed and burned. The parents refused to accept this information until reliable DNA sources are presented. When he thought the microphone was off, he told his aide to end the questions, as he was tired. Ya me cansé. We stand here today saying, we are also tired. Tired of a government that cares more about macroeconomic deals than the security of its people. Tired of corruption. Tired of fighting a war on drugs that will only be solved when demand in the United States decreases. Tired of unsolvable crimes. The state has a responsibility to protect its population. We ask you to do 3 things. Write to your local Mexican embassy or consulate to demand justice. Attend local events in your area to create awareness. Spread the word. Mexican politicians cannot hide if the world is watching them.
A mi hermanito enseñé, jugando en aquel patio a la escuela, a mi hermanito enseñé. Como no había para el viaje, me puse yo a trabajar. Hice mi examen de entrada con ansias, contento de ir a estudiar. Hice mi examen de entrada con ansias a esa escuela rural. El 26 de septiembre sucedió todo lo peor. Fuimos todos agredidos con armas por el gobierno opresor, tirando a darnos directo a mansalva, y mi hermanito cayó. Corrimos todos a un lado para podernos salvar. Los policías en cambio llegaban dispuestos a asesinar.
Okay, I'm going to introduce the 4 panelists now, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. First, we're delighted to have with us Atenea Rosado-Viurques. She was born in Mexico City, and she's currently a graduate student in International and Transcultural Studies at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City. She graduated with honors in pedagogy from the UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And since 2013, she has served as an advisor to the state government of Colima State in Mexico, and also to the government of Haiti, in collaboration with the American Friends Service Committee. She currently serves as the vice president of the foundation A la Izquierda, and she'll be giving her remarks on the topic of the Rural Teachers College and colleges, as well as some background on the student movement in Mexico. Then we will hear from Camila Ruiz Segovia, who's also from Mexico City. Camila is a freshman here at Brown University, where she plans to concentrate in political science, and where she works as a columnist for the Brown Political Review. She participated in the 2011 Movimiento por la Paz con Justicia y Dignidad, the movement for peace with justice and dignity, a mobilization of civil society against the drug war in Mexico. And she'll be focusing her remarks on the student movement in Mexico. Then we'll hear from Paula Martinez, also from Mexico City. Paula is a second-year student here at Brown University, where she currently plans to concentrate in international relations and history. As I mentioned at the outset, Paula recently co-authored a fine piece with Camila Ruiz for the Brown Political Review on Ayotzinapa. And Paula will focus her remarks on the role of the national and local state in the disappearance of students. And then finally, we will hear from Janice Gallagher. Janice is a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International Studies here at Brown. She recently obtained her PhD in government from Cornell University, and she previously earned an MA degree in teaching from Brown University. Janice conducted more than 2 years of field work in both Mexico and Colombia, and she previously worked as a human rights accompanier in Colombia. And her research focuses on the role of organized citizen action and mobilization, and the effects of mobilization on judicial as well as human rights outcomes in Mexico and Colombia. And she will focus her remarks on Mexican and transnational civil society. Okay, so we're going to begin with Atenea. Would you like to come to the podium or give your remarks there, however you like?
I prefer to sit down. Yeah. But I will, thanks. I have a presentation, and it is about 8 minutes, and it's about the people we're going to talk about today. You will see the names of the 43 missing students. I believe many times when we talk about statistics and numbers, we forget names and we forget that they are people, they were people. So these are their names, you will see them. First of all, I would really like to thank Brown for inviting me, and Camila, Paula. And I thank all of you for your interest. I will read, and yeah. Along the next reflection, I will briefly describe the violence crisis in Mexico and how it has affected education for the last 6 years. I will focus on education. I will focus on the tax to education, the disappearance of 22,000 people, according to Human Rights Watch, and the implications it has in the teaching profession and schooling in Mexico. Needless to say, this is an introductory presentation to the topic, and most of its purpose is bringing up some questions that may facilitate further research and actions. The disappearance and suspected killing of 43 education students from the Rural Teachers College Isidro Burgos in Ayotzinapa is not an isolated case, and more attention must be paid to Mexico, its teachers and students. In a country with 120,000 internally displaced people, 22,000 disappeared people, and 121,000 reported deaths related to drug trafficking, according to the Mexican National Institute for Statistics and Geography. The need to ask how conflict has affected daily educational experiences is to be evident. Today, 43 indigenous students from the Rural Teachers College of Ayotzinapa, the state of Guerrero, Mexico, are missing after participating in a protest and being detained by the local police. 22 policemen have been charged, more than 70 municipal authorities have been charged, 10 illegal mass graves have been found since September 19th, 6 bags where presumably the students' ashes are being analyzed, and we're still waiting for forensic experts to confirm that the ashes belong to the missing students. This case is just a small sample of what has happened in my country for the last 6 years, since the war on drugs was declared. According to Human Rights Watch, from 2008 to 2015, there were 22,000 people whose disappearance was related to federal, local, municipal, police, and government actions, while the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack reports 26,000 similar cases. At least 22,000 families who are still looking for their sons, daughters, fathers, mothers. Disappearance, in that sense, does not allow the community to heal because there remains hope and faith of finding the victims. Disappeared persons become a shadow of communities. They belong to our memory and remain in minds. 43 students who wanted to be teachers. The teaching profession, as well as schools, have been a specific target since 2008. I believe that we are not just speaking about 43 young men who disappeared and who were taken by the police, but we must acknowledge that they were going to be teachers and that they were active participants of their communities. Teachers are praised members of communities, especially indigenous rural communities. They know what happens in towns. They are aware of who is whom. They can map power relations and function as catalysts of local empowerment. Teachers, perhaps, know too much about social dynamics. In the most recent report of the Global Coalition to Protect Education Under Attack, the only source about education under attack and conflict in Mexico, Mexico and Colombia are the only Latin American countries where attacks to education have been constant. Since 2009, Mexico has had more than 500 attacks to school infrastructure, teachers, students, university professors, or education personnel. 500 attacks to education since 2009. Armed criminal groups threaten teachers with kidnapping or other violence if they do not hand over a portion of their salaries. Schools may have also been used for military purposes. Secondary schools have been a place for recruitment for narco cartels and for the guerrilla. Teachers in more than 75 schools were threatened. More than 50 students, teachers, academics, and education officials were killed since 2008. In 2011, presumably a drug cartel placed bombs in 6 university campuses and threatened 6 others. In 2009 and 2010, there were numerous gun battles in the vicinity of schools, in some cases resulting in the deaths of students, teachers, or parents. Just as examples, in Reynosa in 2009, 20 teachers reportedly struggled to keep up to 1,000 students lying on the floor with their heads down while, for over 2 hours, grenades exploded and classroom walls were peppered with bullets around them. These bullets were from the military. In 2010, Marta Rivera, a preschool teacher, calmed down her students, then 4 years old, singing while outside there was a shooting. Again, the cartels against the military. Since 2011, shooting lockdowns have been adopted by schools so the kids learn how to be safe when their schools are being threatened. Last weekend, a shooting occurred inside the National University. The police injured a university student who was not armed. This is the third largest university in Latin America. It seems there is something specific about education that makes the sector vulnerable. Why is it that schools are being targeted by gangs and police alike? Despite education being a threatened sector, governmental and cartel attacks to the rural teachers' colleges deserve specific attention. The Mexican state, since the 1960s, has generally abandoned rural teachers' college. These colleges have a long-standing tradition of political organizing and community engagement. In the 70s, Lucio Cabañas, a Mexican guerrilla member and rural teacher killed by the Mexican state as well, said, "Los de Ayotzinapa, los de la Escuela Normal Rural, los metimos por todos los pueblitos, y donde quiera anduvimos haciendo mítines. Incluso cuando estuvimos de dirigentes, dábamos ropa a los pobrecitos campesinos que no tenían con qué vestirse y se acercaban a Ayotzinapa. We, the students from Ayotzinapa, the Rural Normal School, the Rural Teachers College School, went through all the towns. We could organize rallies anywhere. Even when we were leaders, we gave clothes to the poor little peasants who had nothing to wear. They approached Ayotzinapa for help." So this specific teachers' college has a history of the struggle. Teachers and teaching students are dangerous because they empower communities. In a country where 10 million of people are illiterate, the poorest population, those who teach how to read and write are dangerous. The case of the 43 missing teaching students is the top of the iceberg. But one must ask how many students and teachers have been internally displaced. We don't know. What are the implications for curriculum? We don't know. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center and the Norwegian Refugee Council, in its yearly review, calculate that Mexico has more than 160,000 IDPs, being the third country in the Americas with the largest amount of displaced people after Colombia and Guatemala. Nevertheless, Colombia and Guatemala have a larger history, have a larger history of internal displacement. People have displaced internally in Guatemala and Colombia for 30 years, and in 8 years in Mexico, we have got 160,000 IDPs. The main reasons for people to internally displace and many times seek asylum in this country is violence between criminal organizations and security forces and the fear to force recruitment. We do not know how these students and teachers have adapted to their new residences. There is no plan by the Ministry of Education to attend IDPs, teachers, and students' trauma, forced recruitment in schools, violence prevention, peace building. There is no educational plan to protect education from attack in Mexico, to protect teachers, because there is no recognition of the specific threatening that education suffers. There are no reports on the issue from the Mexican government, and data is not available due to security reasons. All data presented here is from international organizations. There is less information regarding how violence has affected curriculum and teaching, even though there is no public policy regarding preparing school for attack. Teachers have had to teach children how to react to these kind of situations. Schools in Mexico are the place where children learn to read and throw themselves to the floor when there is a shooting. School is not a secure place where children can feel safe, nor teachers can feel safe. Being a teacher is not a safe profession in Mexico. How can teachers and communities explain conflict to children? How does the mental presence of missing individuals affect collective actions? How do we explain a conflict that does not have recognition as an emergency situation? It is through education that we can recover collective memory and promote truth and reconciliation. I wonder to what extent can schools advocate for reconciliations if there is no governmental acceptance of conflict. As an example, it took 90 seconds for the Mexican president Enrique Peña Nieto to explain what had happened in Ayotzinapa. Witnesses say that the bodies of the normalistas, of the teaching students, burned for more than 15 hours. Until Ayotzinapa, most international media have covered the Mexican war on drugs as an issue of the state forces trying to combat drug cartels and drug cartels taking revenge to civilians and disappearing them. On the other hand, communities find mass graves and see 43 students being taken away by the police. Is the war on drugs a strategy against drug cartels or against civil population? It's in this context that teachers must start thinking about restoring a culture of learning that does not include formal education in school, but activities that foster reconciliation and community networks. Holding spaces of deliberation and encounter is practicing the right of communities to know what is happening to them. This is also a method of healing and understanding that a part of being home of disappeared people, of IDPs, of people who have been killed, Mexico can be a space for empathy, creativity, and solidarity. A culture of learning implies a culture of peace and caring for others, and that's dangerous. Schools are a fundamental setting for the reconstruction of this culture. There is very, very few research on this. It seems that not only the Mexican state and the international community have lived in denial of COVID for more than 6 years, but also academia. The lack of knowledge about this field has direct consequences, such as the absence of security measures to protect the school, teachers, and students. There are many remaining questions concerning the war on drugs in Mexico and how it has influenced the lives of communities, people, institutions, and schools. There is knowledge and memory to be built. Most of Mexicans know a victim of the war on drugs, and we feel empathy. I'm going to finish here. The Ayotzinapa students, like most of you, were between 17 and 23 years old. They, like many of you, were university students. They, like many of you, believed in education. They, like many of you and me, wanted to help their communities be stronger. It is time for us Mexicans in the world alike to think about how they, or the other 22,000 disappeared men, women, and children, and the 120,000 Mexicans killed since the war on drugs started in 2008 will never be forgotten. Thanks a lot.
Next, we'll hear from Camila Ruiz.
Someone will lead that presentation. Good evening, everybody. On my intervention, I will be covering the student movement response to the events of Ayotzinapa on a national and international level. I would like by simply expressing my gratitude on your presence. Coming to terms with this event has been really hard for me, as it has been for the people in Mexico. A couple of days after I had learned that our students had been forcibly taken by the police and handed over to the United Warriors, I called a very dear friend from home. I was feeling overwhelmed and powerless. It was just very hard to believe that something so brutal could be happening home. Please remember that the students of Ayotzinapa were training to become teachers of the most privileged areas of the country. Please remember that they were students our age, that they were completely innocent, and most importantly, do not forget that it was the state of Mexico who orchestrated the tragedy. My friend told me that the best remedy for pain was action, that crying was important, but moving forward and start thinking about solutions was essential. This is why I'm very happy to see you here. There has been a great response from the international community that I really, really appreciate. Events, as this change matter, acknowledging the brutality of tragedies like the one here in Ayotzinapa may help us understand the world we are living in today and question whether it is how we envision our future. As students, we have the responsibility to start this type of political conversation. We have already talked about the violence that today is defining Mexico. The students of Ayotzinapa are among 20,000 who have been missing since the start of the war in 2006. The case of Ayotzinapa is one in more than 100 cases in which state authorities have participated in the forced disappearance, according to information of the Human Rights Watch. As violence occurs on a daily basis in Mexico, many back home have started regarding it as something normal, as something that is inevitable. But is it really okay to feel afraid to walk in the streets at night? Is it okay to accept that I should avoid traveling to war-affected areas? Is it okay that journalists are feared to report narco-related news? Is it fine that in a macho society like Mexico, violence is gendered? As tragic as the events of the Ayotzinapa are, they have helped us to wake up from this illusion. There is no reason why fear should prevail in Mexican society. Fellow students and family members of Ayotzinapa have come to lead a movement that goes beyond a single cause and brings together a society that is sick of its national situation. On October 8, after a number of small-sided protests, the students of Ayotzinapa led a large-scale demonstration in Mexico City. In streets, people carried candles, crosses, and photographs of the missing students. The phrase, "Alive they took them, alive we want them," was heard over and over as people were marching together. My family and friends were there. This demonstration brought a lot of international attention and support from Mexican and international students from many universities around the world. Fellow students from MIT, Harvard, and Berkeley put up an amazing video where students from 43 nations showed their support. I invite you to watch this video from here. On October 22nd, there was a second large-scale demonstration in Mexico City, with replicas in cities inside and outside the country. On this occasion, students not only demand for the reappearance of the students, but they denounce the state's full responsibility for the events. Mexico City has the third largest square in the world. There, the students wrote, "Fue el Estado." It was a state. The image became one of the most iconic in the movement. During the demonstrations, many students' posters read, "It could have been me." While I understand that this is just a gesture of solidarity, the horrible truth is that in Mexico, some people are more vulnerable to violence than others. This has a lot to do with the profound levels of social inequality that exist in the country. 6% of Mexico's total income is shared by the lowest 20% of the population, while 50% by the upper 20% of Mexicans. Those with less access to opportunities are indeed more vulnerable to violence. Chances are that if you are born in one of the poorest regions of the country, like Iguala Guerrero, you're more likely to be confronted with violence. If you're an educator, if you're young, if you're poor, you're a clear target of a drug war. By the way, the phenomenon of violence and vulnerability also occurs on a global level. Brown students, just by virtue of being here, we enjoy more security than the majority of the world. I don't believe that any human being has more right to be safer than another. Let us recognize our privilege and act accordingly. 43 days happened, and the whereabouts of our 43 students remain unknown. Students called for a global action day on November 5th, in which they invited the international community to stand in solidarity. Participation from the international community has been essential in raising awareness of the event and pressuring the government to take action. Tomorrow, November 20th, participants are calling for a national strike. Many universities and businesses will be closing down to stand in solidarity, and people will be marching again in the streets led by the family members of Ayotzinapa. Once again, the international community will be having actions to support us. As Richard Snyder has mentioned, we will be also having actions here at Brown. I would like to finish my intervention with two thoughts. The first one is on fear and hope. Buenaventura de Sosa Santos, an important human rights activist and professor at Yale University, wrote a letter to the youth of Mexico. In this world, there are two emotions that dominate politics: fear and hope. Students of Mexico, please know that the events of Ayotzinapa are a pure act of violence, and they are aimed to cause resignation in society. They are aimed for you to become hopeless about the future. Those in power and crime know that without hope there is no social change. Please do not give up to fear. Instead, learn how to confront it. You students are the carriers of hope. Do not forget this. My second and last thought is directed to the future of the student movement in Mexico. In Mexico, as in many other Latin American countries, our long-standing tradition of student movement has sadly reproduced the macho, authoritarian, and violent dynamics of our society. Ayotzinapa is giving us an opportunity to reconfigure our social movements. Ayotzinapa is our moment to advocate for a more horizontal, pluralistic, and peaceful political action. One that cracks down the tremendous social division of our country. One where everyone can participate regardless of passion or profession. One where women are not targeted. One where every voice has the same value. This event has taught us that violence only breeds more violence. This is our chance to explore more peaceful dynamics. We ask the world to keep an eye on us today. Our pain runs deep. It keeps us awake. The truth is, however, that when they buried us, we didn't know that we were sticks. Thank you very much.
Paula Martinez.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I, like Camila, would like to thank you for joining us today at the teaching. The past weeks have been very hard for all of us. At the beginning of the demonstrations, living abroad when such important movements are taking place back home left some of us feeling quite powerless. Frustrated that we couldn't be physically there, standing in solidarity with our fellow families and classmates. Now, thanks to the fantastic cooperation and enthusiasm of the Watson Institute, the Center of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Brown University, and most of all, thanks to the enthusiasm and socially engagement of the student community that want to learn more about Mexico, this teaching has been made possible. The international support that Mexico has received in the past weeks has been deeply appreciated, and you are part of it. I am really grateful to all of you for being here today and standing in solidarity with us. In my intervention, I will be discussing the role of the national state around the case in Ayotzinapa. In particular, I would like to bring the following issue to the discussion table. Do the events of Ayotzinapa qualify as a state crime? Given that, as of today, there are still divergent views of the role of the state that the state played in the events, I believe that addressing this topic would be fruitful in the understanding of the complex situation that Mexico faces. In addition, as Janice will be talking about later, the definition of the events of Ayotzinapa as state crimes has been crucial in bringing together different spheres of human rights organizations. As I said, it is important to acknowledge that as of today, there are still conflicting opinions as to whether or not the events of Ayotzinapa constitute a crime of state. On the one hand, several journalists and political scientists, such as Imanol Ordorica and Adolfo Gili, as well as Amnesty International Mexico, have identified the events of Ayotzinapa as state crimes, under the idea that they expose the long-established situation where the violence of the organized crime has been working under government's orders to repress social mobilization. On the other hand, however, there are some who have refused to label Ayotzinapa as a state crime, such as the European Parliament in its resolution adopted in October 23rd. In it, the European nations called for the comprehensive investigations and impartation of justice without impunity in Mexico, but refused to directly blame the Mexican government for the disappearance of the students. What's more, there are also those who have rejected the categorization of the missing students as state crimes, accusing those who use the term as being intellectually dishonest, ignorant, or even trying to destabilize the country. In his conference on November 7, Attorney General Jesus Murillo Caram dismissed the argument that the aggressions against the students in Ayotzinapa were state crimes. In his words, it requires much more for it to be a state crime. Similarly, Maria Amparo Casar, researcher at the CIDE, a university and research institution in Mexico, presented this view in her column from last week, titled State Crime, published in the newspaper Excelsior. According to her, the events of Ayotzinapa do not qualify as state crimes because of two reasons. First, they weren't justified by the government as legitimate acts committed for the benefit of a greater good. Second, she says that when state crimes have been committed, all of the branches and parts of the government have been involved, either by action or omission. Before I begin this analysis, it is interesting to note that Ms. Casar herself establishes in another one of her articles, this one under the name, When Omission Becomes Complicity, that when it came to Ayotzinapa and the general violence rocking Mexico, quote, the authorities from the three government branches, their ministries and agencies, as well as the PRD, and the National Human Rights Commission have been omissive and those accomplices. This one will be discussed later, but I would like to make it clear that she herself addressed this fact. First, I would like to look into Ms. Casar's first point. there has been no justification from the Mexican government regarding the attacks against the students from Ayotzinapa on September 26th. For these reasons, she argues, the events do not constitute a state crime. Indeed, according to Argentinian lawyer Raúl Zaffaroni, cited from the Institute of Juridical Research of the National University, where government discourse in crimes of state is concerned, it must have the following fundamental characteristics. First, it must have a justifying discourse from the government, where the state claims to not be confronting societal values or reinforcing them. And second, it must lead to the reverence of the criminals as heroes or martyrs, perceived to have unwillingly but inevitably committed massive crimes in the name of defending the greater good. The characteristics that I have cited certainly complicate the classification of the events of Ayotzinapa as state crimes. Admittedly, there has been no attempt from the government to justify the disappearance of the students, and instead, several arrests have been carried out against both the United Warriors and the local authorities that were colluded with the organized crime. Furthermore, the President and the Attorney General have and there are harsh blows to the nation and promise that the culprits would be punished. However, it is crucial at this point that we do not forget one thing. The state is defined as the political institutions that monopolize the legitimate use of force in a territory. Being from the government and the police force, the mayor of Iguala, José Luis Abarca, who ordered the attacks against the students in Ayotzinapa, and the police forces that abducted them and turned them over to the United Warriors, are part of the Mexican state. Ayotzinapa, literally, was a crime ordered and carried out by members of the state in collusion with the drug cartels. This leads us to Ms. Casar's second point. The crimes of state require the involvement either by action or omission of all branches and levels of the government. Ayotzinapa, she argues, does not fit this requirement. Amnesty International has indicated the negligence and complicity of the wider state with regards to the case of Ayotzinapa, as well as in the rampant violence in Guerrero and the rest of Mexico for that matter. The fact that the mayor of Iguala had already been accused in 2013 of personally assassinating 3 activists in Guerrero, but no charges had been pushed against him, effectively identifies the heads of the Party of the Democratic Revolution, PRD, and the Attorney General of Mexico as complicit in the Ayotzinapa case today, through their omission of action against the mayor. Moreover, the state's failure to process the denunciations related to the torture and murder of 2 students from Ayotzinapa, the same place, in 2011, at the hands of local and federal police again, further indicate a chilling precedent to the situation we live today. The state authorities knew about the violence present in Ayotzinapa and Guerrero, and did nothing. The involvement of the wider state by action or omission, as Ms. Casar says, is not only present in view of the latest crime in Ayotzinapa, but has been true for many years. Thus, while the events of Ayotzinapa are admittedly lacking the element of justification from the government, the authorities from Iguala ordered the attacks against the students. This characteristic makes it a crime committed by the state, in the sense that the authorities involved belong to the political institutions that monopolize the use of force in Mexico. Furthermore, the lack of actions to punish the precedents of violent behavior from the Iguala mayor in 2015 and from the police groups against the students from Ayotzinapa in 2011 indicate the omission and subsequent complicity of the larger state authorities in the perpetration of the attacks. In other words, Ayotzinapa shows the case of an attack against civilians and social mobilization, ordered by local state authorities in complicity of the wider branches of the state. For these reasons, in my opinion, the events of Ayotzinapa qualify as crimes of state. Thank you.
Janice Gallagher will be the last 4 panelists.
Probably the mic the way it is because she'll be speaking into the microphone.
The microphone doesn't need to be there.
I don't think so because if she's speaking into that microphone, it's coming out of the wire. Just monitor the levels down there.
Thank you, everybody, so much for coming. As the other panelists have said, we're all really grateful for making time in your schedule, in your lives, to think about what's happening in Mexico right now. I feel especially honored to join this panel. As Richard said, I lived in Mexico for most of 2011, 12, and 13, working primarily with groups of family members directly affected by the drug violence that we've seen under the Calderon administration, and especially with the Movimiento por la Paz, the Movement for Peace, which is led by poet Javier Sicilia. Today I want to talk about three different things. First, I want to talk about the fact that resistance to violence in Mexico is not new. Second, I want to talk about the new coalitions that we're seeing emerging as a result of what's happened in Ayotzinapa, which I think is actually a reason for hope. Finally, I'm going to talk about the implications of the United States. So in what ways is the U.S. complicit in what's happened in Mexico, and what does that imply for many of us who have U.S. citizenship and at the very least are living here currently. So first, resistance to violence is not new. So a colleague of mine, Sandra Lele, and I worked together, and this is her work, looking at documenting all of the protests that have happened in response to violence in Mexico since 2006. I was prompted to share this slide specifically because I was listening to the radio a couple weeks ago about what had happened in Ayotzinapa and in the U.S. And the announcer said, "So why is this the first time that we see Mexican civil society responding to the violence in Mexico?" And that is simply not true, right? People in Mexico have been, alzando las voces, have been raising their voices about what has been happening in terms of the rise in violence since it started, really in 2007 and in 2008. So we can see here, this is when Fernando Martí's son was kidnapped and subsequently killed. Here is the Marcha Nacional por la Paz. This is after Javier Sicilia's son was killed in March of 2011. And here are the caravans for peace that the Movement for Peace sponsored. So just to underline, these are not in some ways, unfortunately, it's not new that Mexicans are saying, people in Mexico are saying this is not acceptable and there's something to be done. And these protests were happening throughout the Mexican state from 2006 to 2012. You can see, for those of you who are familiar with the map, those areas which have had the highest violence, Chihuahua, Guerrero, Nuevo León, also have, unsurprisingly, the highest number of protests. So people have been reacting. Who has been reacting? Human rights organizations have been reacting. Human rights organizations formed, and we don't have the data, unfortunately, which shows the earlier protests, but human rights organizations formed largely in response to the Dirty War, in response to the student massacre of 1968, and they formed in Guerrero, which is the state which the Dirty War affected the most. They formed in Mexico City, and they formed in the south, in Oaxaca and Chiapas, which were also targeted by the Dirty War. So human rights organizations have existed in Mexico since the 60s, 70s, 80s, and these organizations are organizing some of the reaction against the violence that's happening. Victims and their families, largely since the emergence of the Movement for Peace, have emerged in nearly every city and every state affected by the violence, right? Sometimes these organizations are connected to human rights organizations, but largely these organizations have been mothers, fathers, spouses of those young men and women, sometimes not young, who've been disappeared, who've been murdered during this wave of violence. So they have been organizing sometimes small but significant protests against what is happening. Finally, schools and universities, right? As Camila talked about, students have been hard hit by this violence, and they have also been organized. So, but these protests were largely separately organized, right? Prior to what has happened in Ayotzinapa, there's really different groups, excuse me, that are mobilizing and not necessarily together. I think it's worth highlighting the human rights organizations formed when violence was clearly coming from the state. And when we had this more generalized violence, in which 70,000 people have been killed since 2006, in which the material and intellectual author of the crimes is often not clear. So I think a way of thinking about the violence since 2006 is that it's been a lodo. It's been a mud in which there's no state and there's no drug trafficking organizations. They've kind of mixed. So there's no water, there's no earth. They've mixed to become a mud of who's responsible for that violence. Human rights organizations have therefore not wanted to get too involved in what's happening because it's not clearly the state that's perpetrating the violence. And I think there's been some good critiques, but I interviewed the head of one of the most prominent human rights organizations who said, what we're good at is talking about state violence. When it's more complicated, right, when the violence comes from this mud, it's more difficult for us to be involved. So that's kind of where we found ourselves before the Ayotzinapa disappearances. So who's responding, right? So that was who was organizing the violence before the Ayotzinapa protests. Now who's responding? Human rights organizations, local organizations, and student organizations. So these three groups that were organizing separately, we see them all becoming involved in the Ayotzinapa organizing. So Tlachinoyan, which is one of probably the most prominent human rights organization, not only in Guerrero, but also in Mexico, has taken on the case. They're devoting their resources, their lawyers, to working on the Ayotzinapa case. Centro Pro DH, which is the largest human rights organization in Mexico City, has hosted the fathers, the mothers, the family members of these disappeared students at their center. So all of these organizations, especially the human rights organizations, are coming together. This is a crime. This is a human rights violation that resonates with people who've been directly affected, who have a family member that's been disappeared. It resonates with students, and it resonates with the human rights community. So the opportunities for collaboration and a different type of organizing are larger than I think we've ever seen before. So what does this mean for the United States? So the Movement for Peace, which we all have talked about a little bit, in 2012 conducted a cross-national caravan. In 33 days, they went to 27 U.S. cities, and they assembled more than 300 organizations in the United States to work against the forces that had caused violence in Mexico. So there was about 100 people that crossed the country and talked to all of these organizations in the U.S., including the NAACP, which is the largest organization of African Americans in the country. They were a key sponsor of this caravan. The national NALAC, which is the National Association of Latin American and Caribbean Communities, LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, former members of the former policemen and soldiers who had been involved in the drug war. So this caravan recognized that the causes of violence in Mexico are also affecting people in the United States, right? So it was trying to build a bi-national coalition to talk about what are the policies that are creating violence in Mexico, and what do those look like in the United States, and what can we do about them? So they focused on four different sets of U.S. policies, which we can really see are driving the violence in Mexico. So the first and most important is drug prohibition. So there's no good numbers exactly on what portion of the drug profits are coming, for example, from the sale of marijuana in the United States. But one number that is out there is that about 60% of cartel profits come from the sale of marijuana in the United States. What is certain is that the money that is supporting a lot of the violence comes from drug use in the United States. And that one concrete thing that we in the United States can do is start thinking about the decision to consume drugs as a political one. Right? I'm coming from working in Colombia, where the most radical groups, especially groups of young people, have taken a really hard stance against the consumption of cocaine, for example. It's very clear that consuming cocaine in Colombia fuels the violent conflict. I would ask us in this room in the same vein to think about the personal consumption choices we're making, especially around marijuana, which is kind of we don't think about as perhaps being linked to commodity chains which are supporting violence, and some locally grown isn't, but a lot of it is, right? So thinking through that, I think, is an important thing that we can be doing. On a policy level, the changes in drug policy in the United States are an important part of so questioning prohibition is something important that we're already doing in the U.S. that I think helps what's happening in Mexico, and I think it's helped foster dialogue inside of Mexico about alternatives to drug U.S. military support. The U.S. has given about $1.2 billion to Mexico since 2008, most of which has gone towards efforts to eradicate the drug trade, and in some way has ended up in the pockets of the military. I was in Mexico City at the U.S. Embassy interviewing the people who were in charge of spending all that money, and I asked them, so what's happened to all this money that's been spent, especially within the military? And they're like, well, we have training sessions, we buy, we're helping to buy a lot of weapons, but afterwards, we're not really sure, right? So our tax money is going towards the military, is being funneled towards police departments, and the U.S. has no idea how it's being used, right? I think that's something we really need to think about as U.S. citizens, right? So our money is implicated in the Commission of Commerce, partially because it's really hard to buy guns in Mexico, right? Most of the guns in Mexico, again, these are hard figures to come by, but a lot of them are coming from the United States. It is legal currently to buy via the internet or at gun shows weapons along the border, and then you carry them into Mexico. Nobody's checking whether or not you're bringing, 100 semi-automatic weapons or 1,000 when you cross the border into Mexico. So the way we've started to think about easy access to weapons being a problem in our own communities, it's a huge problem in Mexico as well. Finally, money laundering. So this money, not only are weapons flowing across the border, but money is too, and feeding the problems of that. So I know that these are larger macro issues, but I think although Ayotzinapa is a key kind of wake-up call, unfortunately, it is not the first time that we're seeing egregious violence happening in Mexico, and in which complicity in which U.S. policy is causal in producing those terrible events. So thank you all so much for coming. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I want to thank the four panelists, and we're going to open things up for discussion and questions. And I'm going to take my prerogative as chair of the panel to throw out the first question. A number of you alluded to actions that people like those here today in the audience can take to get involved if they're moved by this situation in Mexico. What if the panelists could say a little bit more about recommendations for those who are moved to take action, to do something?
Yep. So to reiterate, I think, again, the most basic thing is thinking about in our daily lives. The fact that you're all here, not to oversell it, but really is hugely important. Staying up on what's happening. This produces a political cost to what's happening, right? That is the most important thing I think that we can do from here, is show that there are people who care about this issue outside of Mexico, that our eyes are there. That political pressure is really important for figuring out what happened to the students, as well as hopefully changing the patterns that lead to this type of violence. I think policy-wise, voting, applying pressure to U.S. policymakers to reverse some of the policies that are leading to a context in which this violence is happening is important, and again, our own consumer decisions, specifically around the consumption of drugs or some concrete things. And then we have some actions on campus, for example. Do you want to talk about this?
Yes, Richard already talked about them. So tomorrow we're going to have an exhibit on the main green. We would really encourage you to come and to take pictures of the event. I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, thanks to international support, we've been able to pressure the Mexican government to take action on events. So really, this global forum right now will be gathering a lot of photos, and it would be really, really helpful if you could come tomorrow and take pictures, and just by spreading the word, it's essential for us.
Well, yeah, to reiterate, obviously the presence, raising awareness is something that is of vital importance, so thank you all for coming. However, I would like to encourage you not to keep it in the classroom, do not keep it here, but really in addition to being active in the campaigns that are happening, in addition of like tomorrow's events that you guys should go, it is also about taking this, like the situation of the drug war in Mexico and applying it to your daily life. A lot of, it's about consumption decisions, and I would really like to invite you to become more aware as to where the marijuana that is around colleges in the United States, where it comes from, and really make some conscious decisions that is fueling a lot of problems in Latin America, in my country.
Hi everyone, I'm Sylvia Hernandez. I wanted to speak a little bit more about the event that's been referenced for tomorrow. It's actually more of an exhibit. It's going to be on the main green all day. Facilities will be setting up 43 empty chairs on the main green at 8 a.m. With portraits of each missing student. So like the panelists have said, it would be incredibly powerful if you all could visit the exhibit and make of it what you get inspired. So take a picture, even bring something to the exhibit, and just afterwards keep getting educated and be involved in like understanding what crisis actually could lead to. It inspired me to think that there was a stronger social movement happening in Mexico, and although it isn't new. It is, again, another curve on that graph, and if it can continue, it would be.
Okay, why don't we open it up for questions from the audience? So a question from Veronica Zubillaga, the visiting professor, COVID visiting professor from Caracas, Venezuela, here at Brown this semester.
Hi. I come from Venezuela, so we are all suffering as well consequences of violence and the drug prohibition. So departing from a violence reduction approach, what do you think, Janice, about transferring the drug issues from the judicial sphere to the sanitary sphere, and then starting to think about debating about legalizing drugs, in the sense that studies from, for example, from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, shows that if cocaine would be legal, would have the price of coffee. But because it is illegal, it has the price of gold. And also it shows that people in Bolivia who grows cocaine only wins 2% of their final prices. So there are a lot of people interested in having illegal drugs. So maybe moving ourselves in order to ask debates for legalizing drugs, or at least transferring them from the judicial sphere to the sanitary sphere. That would be, that would at least looks like it would change things.
So I wanted to say thank you so much for your question and your comments. We invite comments very much too. We all have specific experience, but we know that there's expertise and great experience here as well. So please feel free. So I'll respond kind of with the initiatives that I know that are happening around questioning this kind of drug prohibition paradigm. The reason we're calling it a drug prohibition paradigm is because most people who've been in the U.S. a while, when we say prohibition, it immediately draws to mind the prohibition that the U.S. tried on alcohol, which failed miserably. Right? When we prohibited alcohol, we know it caused violence. We know that it didn't work, and those of us who are thinking about questioning the prohibition on drugs, that's why we're using that language. I think the language on transferring it from the judicial sphere to thinking about drugs as a public health issue, I think, is the right way to talk about it, right? So we know that taking drugs, it can be bad for their health. It has a lot of bad ramifications. But when we start thinking about the problem that consuming drugs causes, and we think about it in terms of public health, I think it leads us to much more productive places. The UN General Assembly has a special session on reconsidering the way that we in the world control and legalize drugs in 2016. There's already a lot of great organizing going on around the world, and about how we can dismantle the judicial, kind of the laws that we have around drugs and do something more productive. So I'm excited about the conversations that we're going to have around the UN General Assembly special session in 2016. So if you haven't heard about that, take a look. It's going to be happening in New York, and I think it's a great opportunity for rethinking and a great space to think about what policy change would look like if we're not just doing it in Washington State and Uruguay and in kind of country by country, but it's time to come together as a world community and say the drug prohibition is not working. It's making people poor. It's leading to people being incarcerated at crazy rates, and it's doing a lot of terrible things for our community. Let's stop. So thank you for that question.
Did any of the other panelists want to respond to that? Okay, other questions or comments? Yeah, you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jose. Thank you very much for the very interesting information. I would like to point out to a sign that there was one of the pictures of the video at the beginning. It said something like, "Saquen esos sociópatas de aquí." That's la bendita cuestión. That's the question here. They're sociopaths, and when you talk about about social political costs, about raising awareness, there is a political cost, but when you're dealing with sociopaths, and these are sociopaths as much as the people handling the money of the United States and European banks, effectively, from this drug war, as much as the people that are here that are complicit and they know about it, and the people all throughout Latin America that are just like taking advantage from the military aid to gain political power and to gain economic leverage in their own countries, you know. These are sociopaths, and when it comes to this, we need to be thinking more about what's the political gain of doing this. And the political gain is what we've been saying, it's like raising consciousness to like when questions like drug prohibition come, questions of like military, or questions about banks, or questions about what is the real structure of how United States is exporting their problems, including this, including their pedophiles, with the Megan laws, including everything. No. What is the structure? What are the channels? And what is the need of the United States to do this? When these questions come in every like election, not election, when every like elections don't do anything, when questions come of like whether organized and mobilized or not to, this is the political gain that we got, this image of what's happening in Mexico. It gets closer and closer to our perception. It gets closer to like our incentive to like do something about it. That's the political gain. That's what's going to do something about it. So.
Thank you for the comment. Okay. Other comments or questions from the folks? Yeah, sure.
Okay. I just want to point something out that I think has not been spoken today necessarily. It is the power of social media. Like sadly, in Mexico, the media is largely controlled by the government. But really, social media has a tremendous power. It's probably the single most powerful means of sharing what's going on. Like, so I just want to encourage you all to, things as simple as posting a picture on Facebook. We really, to me, may sound silly. Like, what's the picture gonna do? The reality is that in Mexico, the fact that the media is controlled by the government, in addition to all the violence against people who dare to write about what's going on in Mexico, that really many people don't really know what's going on, and I feel like I don't know if you talked about it. I'm sorry if I just missed that, but I think that's something very, very important. Social media has power that I cannot even describe.
I can comment on that. Yeah, I think I personally believe a lot in the power of media, the power of social media. I think for the first time we have an opportunity to undermine state decision. Whatever they say, we can quickly go on social media and criticize it. I think the role of social media was really important in Mexico during the Siempre movement, a student movement in 2012. And I do think that media has helped a lot this movement to connect quickly. I think that the fact that this forum is being connected with many other forums in other universities already speaks about the importance of the internet to bring people together for more action. And I honestly believe that things as simple as a hashtag may put together a lot of information for people to learn more from a different perspective. So yeah, use social media. It is important. It brings people's perspective for the first time and it puts it on the first place. So yeah.
At the same time, I feel that I would like to agree with Camila and say that social media really works, but at the same time, I would like to encourage you to also talk to your peers about it, to not just take it into the social media. I think one of the biggest problems that have been happening, and as Atenea pointed out, is that these are names and these are people, and these are not just figures, and these are not just campaigns that stay as campaigns. This should be something that let us have real social action, like what was organized today, the teaching, and tomorrow the commemoration. This is something that should be spurring more active participation from the community.
Yeah, just one last comment. It's just we should regard social media as a tool rather than as a concrete action. But let us use that tool as much as possible.
I just to add, I think again, I work with a lot of local groups who are kind of Ayotzinapa working in Baja California, in Tamaulipas, in Veracruz, in different Mexican states around the issue of disappearances. And often they don't have an office. They might not be registered as a civil organization, but they are on Facebook. And I think what they want more than anybody else, they put they're using Facebook, they're using Twitter to diffuse, to spread the images of those who are disappeared. So we're looking for people, we want to find them alive, they were disappeared alive. And so Facebook, if you're interested in what those groups are doing, they're not too hard to find on Facebook. She's my friend, I'm friends with all of them. And connect if you're interested in what's going on in the different states. A lot of people are coming to me from different parts of Mexico and asking what's going on. The best information I'm finding is on the Twitter feeds and on the Facebook pages of groups, of local groups, because there's a very low barrier to entry. They can be out there in an anonymous and safe way as well. That's not true for a lot of the journalists. So thank you. It's a really important point.
Yeah, I agree. It's very, very important we use it. However, we must remember that there are people in Mexico who don't have access to the internet. 60% of the population in Mexico don't have access to daily internet. So we must be aware that these campaigns are very targeted to the middle social class in Mexico, the students, the people who know how to read, how to write, how to use Twitter, and that there are those who don't have any voice on this because they don't know how to read, they don't know how to write, they haven't had those opportunities to access to internet.
There's a question here. Yes.
Yes.
Sure.
Thank you all so much for this teaching. I wanted to ask if there have been.
Can you speak a little more loudly? Hard to hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the teaching. I wanted to ask about the connection between what's happening in Mexico and then organizing of Mexicans who are living in the U.S. and kind of like the Latino movement here in the States, and if there has been collaboration and what that looks like. Because you were talking about the ways that the U.S. is implicated, and also migration to the U.S. is very much tied with this violence. I'm just wondering how that's being addressed.
Yeah, well, I know that tomorrow for the call for a national strike in Mexico, there's gonna be a lot of replicas here in the U.S. and those are being the Mexicans living in the U.S. are the ones who are going to the embassies to take action. So they have also played a very important role at just trying to raise awareness of the issue in universities, but also in their local communities. I don't think there's been a separation at all. On the contrary, I think we have worked together quite well. But not only with Mexicans in the US, but actually with Mexicans in every part of the globe. But really something that has bring us together, pain brings together, unfortunately. But yeah, there's having an active participation.
Yeah, I would also say that we are safe here. that we can speak about this here. But people in Mexico, many people have been killed just for what they advocate on Twitter. And just to value the freedom to speak here, and that's why I think we must be allies and we must get more people to talk about it, because just by the fact that we can. So actually I could say that some things are being spoken here and not there.
One last thing, there's a newspaper by the Mexican community in the US. It's called El Beisman, and they have really created a very great writing community. So yeah, there's many concrete examples of these kind of things happening. You just look for them and try to put them together.
And I think so far, and correct me if you ladies think it's different, I think we've seen coordinated actions mostly by university students so far in the US, right? So I think not most campuses, but a lot of campuses are having teach-ins. The wonderful video that we showed at the beginning was put together by students at different universities. And I know I have friends at Berkeley, at Chicago, at Columbia, who are all involved in doing things similar to this. I think partially because there's a rapid response ability because of social media, because we're all together, we get to live near each other and come together in places. In terms of, so Chicago and LA have the highest number of Mexicans in the US, and in terms of mass marches, I don't think it's happened yet. And I think the organizations are talking about it, but I think there's still it's still pretty new. I think we're going to see kind of how it happens, and I don't think we should think that those aren't going to happen, but as of now, we haven't seen kind of large marches a la 2006 immigration reform, for example. But I think it's, I guess I've said what I think, right? I think there's opportunities for new coalitions that are happening, and that this has a lot of resonance. It touches a lot of people for one reason or another. So I think it'll be interesting to see what we see.
Yes.
So I have a similar question about organizing in the US. So I know that, especially about drug prohibition, it's a long-term goal. It's like beyond Ayotzinapa, but most of the people affected by incarceration because of the drug prohibition are communities of color, so Black and Latino communities in the US. Is there a long-term plan, like, do you see that there's in the future some sort of collaboration on people trying to like maybe vote more, addressing senators and like addressing more government action to legalize, especially something like marijuana, where if Black Americans get like ridiculous incarceration, sentences over marijuana possession or sales, and it's like kind of it's very connected between what's going on in Mexico right now and the war on drugs in the US. So do you think there's a future for maybe working together between like communities of color here and Mexicans?
So yeah, so I think probably thank you so much for that question. I think it's a really important one. I think one of the most exciting conversations I was a part of, I was one of the coordinators of this caravan, was between Michelle Alexander. So for those of you who think about the drug war in the US, her book, which is called The New Jim Crow, details how the drug war has been used, essentially the New Jim Crow, to create specifically to kind of relegate African Americans, especially African American men, to second-class citizens through the use of drug laws, right? So those of you who don't know that book and are interested in this issue, I encourage you to read it. So she had a conversation with Javier Cecilia during this caravan, which I think so I think that was there's motion towards uniting the struggles against the drug war in both Mexico and the US. And I think there's a growing realization that the costs really are shared costs, right? So it's causing violence and militarization. So using the logic of the drug war, we see Canadians of color in the US being disproportionately affected by violence. We see the pernicious effects of the drug war permeating communities on both sides of the border. So I think there's definitely opportunity. I think that's why the NAACP signed on to this caravan. In most of the border cities that this caravan went along, The focus was on having a conversation about with policymakers as well as with communities about how can we come together in a different kind of coalition than we've ever come together before. So it's within communities of color, it's also parents of people who suffer from addiction, right? Who've been criminalized instead of receiving healthcare. It's family members and actual former policemen and members of the military who've lost their partners. So there's a great Neil Franklin is the president of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. He was a Baltimore City cop for 20 years and lost his partner on a drug raid. And after that, was just like quit and led started to lead this organization out of this realization that it's just not working. It's not working in the US and it's not working in Mexico. So I think there's a lot of movement towards that. And I think there's great organizing that's being done and to be done around the issue.
Other comments or questions from the audience? Yeah, Jerome Marsden.
Hi, again, thank you all for coming. Very interesting, and we all appreciate it a lot. I was wondering if the panelists could speak a little bit more about state involvement and how and human rights organizations' responses to it. Janice, for example, you mentioned that this is a muddy issue, and because of that, human rights organizations, many of them are more hesitant to get involved, especially the international ones. And I was wondering if you all could speak a little bit more about that.
So somebody,
yeah. So the director of the Americas Initiative of Human Rights Watch, mentioned that even though there have been many human rights attacks in violations in Mexico for the last 6 years, this was the worst one, because it was very clear that the state was participating in this. I think that, as Janice mentioned, many human rights organizations don't want involvement because it is hard and it takes a lot of resources, and these organizations do not have enough funding. If you are thinking on how to participate, funding is another option. So many of them don't have funding, and they pick very strategically what cases they want to take. And this one is very, very, very clear that the local government was participating and that the federal government didn't react. I mentioned it, but I think it's important. The Mexican president spoke 90 seconds about this, and he hasn't said anything else. So there is a mission, and it is pretty. I would say that it is very clear. This is the clearest case.
I would like to share an image that I was actually going to put up today. I think for the state budget in particular, it has been really important to point out this event as a state crime. Just right here. So during one of the demonstrations here, so the students wrote in the square in Mexico, "El Estado," and I think it is really important to recognize this event as such, because that's the only way we can really kind of address it and realize how brutal it was. So it's just, I think for all the panelists here, we would all agree that it's a state of crime, and yeah, we should just leave that very clear.
So I think Amnesty International has recently started to open centers within Latin America. So I think there's a legitimate critique of kind of the big international human rights organizations that are located in the global north, and there's been significant movement in the international community to fix that, right? So I think Amnesty International, I've been getting a lot more emails actually in Spanish from Amnesty than in English about what's going on in Ayotzinapa, and I think that's actually a really positive movement, right? So there's kind of new human rights centers forming in the global south, and a lot of them are making a lot of noise about the Ayotzinapa case. So I think that's really positive. think we also see intergovernmental organizations have been activated. So for example, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has agreed to play a consultative role on the investigation of what happened in Ayotzinapa. I don't really know what that means, and hopefully that will lead to something good. I think the international human rights community has been watching what's going on in Mexico. Human Rights Watch in 2011 put out a really important report about disappearances in Mexico. Amnesty International, when I was in these states, especially on the northern border, that have been heavily affected, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is there. As in literally representatives from that office are visiting these local small organizations, often which are victim-led, and or the family members of people who've been victimized are the ones leading those organizations, and they're seeing what they can do. They're helping diffuse helping to publicize what's happening. So I think the international community has been there and is kind of doing what we would hope they would do, given this. But again, I think it's soon. It didn't happen very long ago, and I think we're still seeing if this is going to be a game changer, right? We're still seeing if this is going to provoke a different level of response that's going to really help push through changes in some of the underlying dynamics. And again, not to hit it too hard, but this UNGAS, the UNGAS 2016, Google it if you haven't, this international forum, so the UN is going to host this conversation about drug policy reform, and a lot of the human rights organizations are thinking about being involved, which is a big deal, right? Usually you don't think about human rights and drug policy reform, no, those are separate. But because of exactly the question that this woman here brought up about, the drug prohibition regime is causing human rights abuses. And I think the UN, the human rights, insofar as human rights organizations are willing to kind of go to the root of the problem and be involved in this in UNGAS 2016, I think it's a really good and productive coalition and reframing of some of the real issues that are underlying what's going on.
All right, so we're almost down to 7. I want to see if ask Paula or Atenea if they have any closing thoughts they wanted to offer. Janice and Camila, just see. Is there anything that you wanted to say at the end here? Or?
I guess I just wanted to thank you all again for joining us and also live stream. And I would really like to invite you to take what you've learned and what we've been discussing this evening, and not only get engaged more in the following movements that are going to happen at Brown and in the US and back home for many of us, but also to apply it to your daily life.
Yeah, I would just like to point out what Paula said, sorry, about the power of knowledge. These people knew things. These students knew things. These students were sharing what they know, and they knew how to read and how to write. And knowledge is very powerful. And the same applies to you, because knowing where your drugs come from is very powerful. Just holding ourselves accountable of our daily lives and what we can know and what we research, like where any product comes from, is very, very important. I just would like to remind you that you know many things and that therefore you have power.
And responsibility.
And responsibility. A lot of responsibility.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.